The longest season in Formula One history just came to an end in Abu Dhabi. When the checkered flag came down for the 22nd time this season, fans were left with a smile on their face as large as Ricciardo himself when he finished ninth. The finish meant way more than the 2 championship points Daniel had won for McLaren in his last race. Let's take a look at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, starting off with redemption for Ricciardo at Abu Dhabi. There was a time in Ricciardo's career when position 9 wouldn't have felt like that big of a deal, but put this result in context of the year the Aussies had on the track, and you can appreciate his relief on crossing that finish line, not to mention the fact that this was his last race for McLaren after being rather unceremoniously released from his contract. Aside from finishing top 5 in Singapore and finishing just outside the top 5 at his home Grand Prix, Daniel didn't really make much of a meaningful contribution to McLaren's aspirations this year. His younger teammate Lando Norris didn't have a magnificent season, but he had an overwhelming majority of the contributions of points to a team that was fighting Ferrari for third last year. He was faster in qualification and just had more pace on race day, outstripping Daniel's 7 points finishes with his own 18 top 10 finishes and McLaren's sole podium this season. When it was announced in the summer that Ricciardo wouldn't be driving for the Papaya team next year, nobody was surprised, and they didn't blame Zak Brown for it either. The team needed better. This sport is ruthless. These are hard realities an elite has to face, and Daniel really put everyone's mind at ease by finishing the race and grabbing a couple of points. Moving on, there are no hard feelings for Daniel at McLaren. It may seem harsh to cut a driver that still had a year left on his contract, but there are no hard feelings between Daniel and the McLaren team. His time in Papaya has had more ups than downs, and both parties realize another season with one underperforming driver could put them in the back seat of development in F1's new regulation era. Any doubts we might have had were dispelled when the team told Daniel to press C1 on his steering wheel to reveal his win at Monza appearing on the dash.
Triumphant in Monza.
The sport is a tricky one. It's not so black and white, I guess, and sometimes you do struggle to find some answers, but...
The always cheerful Daniel was at a loss for words, choking up while he mustered up a thank you for the team and their efforts over the past 2 years. After the race, the Australian driver expressed his relief over how the race went, admitting that the collision from the previous race would have made for a pretty sad end. Instead, we got to see Danny Rich make it into Q3 on Saturday, take a grid penalty for causing a collision last time out.
Like, you strip it down to the core, competition is competition. You know, you're trying to outplay someone, outsmart someone. You're ultimately just trying to be better than...
And comb his way through the field to 9th position. Let's take a look at some of the best action from Abu Dhabi in closer detail. Let's look at some memorable moments to remember from the season finale. Unlike last year, Max winning the championship was no surprise this year. The F1 community was more focused on the 4 drivers that would be leaving the grid, including Danny, the increasingly quick Mercedes pair, and the intense battle for second in the Drivers' Championship.
He collects the winner's trophy then for the 12th time. A 32nd career win then for Max Verstappen. Same as Fernando Alonso.
If we were to pick a single moment from the race to remember it by, it would be the battle between Daniel and Vettel. Both fan favorites were involved in a struggle for 9th, with Vettel attacking Ricciardo for nearly 10 laps till the finish. Watching the two have fun in their last race and scoring points is the therapy everyone needed to help them come to terms with losing 2 legends in one go. Mick Schumacher had a pretty unceremonious release from Haas, with the team forbidding him to do donuts after his last race, and Nicholas Latifi made his exit from Williams. On the opposite end of the grid, though, Red Bull's Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc were locked in a battle for 2nd place.
Leclerc goes across the rumble strip. Perez tries to get him on the outside of the final corner. Leclerc comes home to take 2nd place ahead of Sergio Perez.
Whoever finished on the 2nd step would also take the lead on the season points table, and Charles managed to outpace Checo to seal Ferrari's runners-up spot in both Constructors' and Drivers' Championships. Coming up, Daniel's farewell message. The waterworks didn't end at the emotional farewell on the radio after the race. They were renewed at Daniel's message to his fans on Twitter later on. The Aussie spoke one last time to thank the Papaya Army for their support and admitted his shortcomings of not being a points car this season. He was grateful for the finish and the fight with Seb, saying he felt more fulfilled than he had all season. Even his race engineer recognized the glimpses of old Honey Badger form, breaking late into the corners.
200s from 3rd or something like that, like, yeah. It's so small, it's just frustrating.
Slick overtaking, and the kind of defense that won Ricciardo Monaco. Fans were heartbroken over losing Daniel, but the Aussie isn't going very far. He's most likely coming back next year as a reserve driver, and some recent controversies high up the grid would open up a seat for Ricciardo in 2024. Let's take a closer look at what the future may hold for the most lively driver on the grid. On to our next segment. Will Daniel Ricciardo ever race in F1 again? First up, the prodigal son returns to Red Bull. Ricciardo assured us over the summer that he may be going off the grid for a bit, but he was going to be intimately related to Formula One while he was away by staying on as a reserve driver. It seemed like too much to hope for, but Red Bull team principal Christian Horner confirmed that only the paperwork needs to be signed for the Honey Badger to come home. When the press asked Daniel about it, he said he was looking forward to making it official. Daniel scored all but the most recent of his victories with Red Bull. With the driver and team gelling along really well until Max started taking the dugout and the world by storm. The surprises moved the Renault, and then another skittish entry into McLaren couldn't produce the kind of pace and confidence Ricciardo had in the Red Bull. In hindsight, many realize that Ricciardo's driving style is just better suited for the loose rear end and snappy brakes Red Bull produces. This makes him a really good reserve driver for his former team because it allows him to be involved in the development of the car without risking a drop in performance on the track. Once Danny works with the car for a season and gets back into the groove of things, he could turn that reserve seat into a racing one. Next up, could recent tensions lead to a seat opening at Red Bull? Those following the sudden change in behavior between teammates Verstappen and Perez may cause a brewing storm at Red Bull next season. In a pretty direct manner, Verstappen is the reason Perez didn't finish second in the Drivers' Championship. Checo allowed Max through in the Brazilian Grand Prix under team orders, being promised a swap in position if Verstappen couldn't overtake the car in front. However, Max refused to give Sergio the place back despite failing to overtake Alonso, costing him 2 precious points. Had Perez not had to fight so hard for second today and gone for the fastest lap instead, he'd have tied for second. This may seem like a long shot, but the point is the effort the teammate puts into playing a part in their partner's success. After the monumental contribution Checo made to Verstappen's title aspirations last year, you would expect Max to let his teammate have 6th place in a race that made no impact on his title aspirations. He'd won the championship weeks ago. Max claimed he had his reasons to do what he did, but this could be the end of a wholesome and effective driver pairing. If there's anything we know about the Red Bull second seat, it's a hard one to hang on to. In case that happens, we imagine Daniel would be the first pick if he's a reserve for Red Bull. Lastly, does Daniel have other options? The Red Bull deal seems pretty close to final, but it's not a done deal until the contract is signed, and in Formula One, even that can change pretty fast. Even if this return was to fall though, we feel Ricciardo has some solid options for reserve next season. For one, Mercedes team principal Toto Wolff has been pretty open about how much Ricciardo is liked in the Mercedes garage. In an interview earlier this season, he said they'd love to have Daniel on as a reserve driver if the stars ever aligned. If they did, it would be a solid move for Ricciardo. The British Giants came into their former form in the last few races of the season, sealing a solid 1-2 finish in Brazil. Other than Mercedes, there's not a team on the grid that wouldn't benefit from a driver with the multiple race-winning experiences Ricciardo brings. The Aussie may have said he'd want a bit of distance from the sport next year, but we doubt it's the last we've seen of the Honey Badger. That's a wrap for this video. Leave your final messages for Daniel Ricciardo in the comments below, and let us know what you think the future holds for the Honey Badger. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more Formula One updates.